Okay, this is David Zierler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It is September 9th, 2021. Once again, it's my great honor to be with Charlie Trimble. Charlie, it is great to see you again.
Great to see you. Great to be with you, David.
Charlie, today I'd like to set the stage and provide some historical context for the world as you saw it circa 1964, 1965, as you began your professional career at HP. And I'll return to a comment you made earlier that I'd like you to develop a little bit more, and that is your recognition at the time that HP was transitioning from an analog to a digital world. I wonder if you could describe a little bit about what the analog world looked like at that time and why there was the both business and scientific imperative for HP really to be at the vanguard of the digital revolution.
All right. Now, whether what I have to say is at the level that the digital revolution now means, I don't really know. If anyone that's looked into HP history knows that HP actually got its start before World War II. I guess it was 39, with an oscillator project, an audio oscillator that was used in Disney's movie The Fantasia. And so the beginning period at HP had to do with the generation of test equipment, largely for other electrical engineers. I mean, it's the next bench syndrome concept, where you see what the problems that the engineer that is working next to you has, and you come up with a solution to help mitigate them or to solve them. And so this was the basis of the HP instrumentation business model. And so in the very early days, you had a whole line of oscillators starting from the original audio oscillator up through microwave signal generators, and then moving into oscilloscopes and let's see now, I want to say spectrum analyzers, but fundamentally instrumentation that dealt with the frequency domain. My mentor at HP, Al Bagley, when I said he drove them into the digital domain, he recognized that one of the most fundamental standards known to man in terms of accuracy and repeatability was frequency. And so if you could convert the measurement that you were making so that you would use the power of the stability of a crystal oscillator, or later a cesium standard, if you could transform the measurement into one where you were comparing it against a frequency standard, you could generate something of higher repeatability, accuracy, and precision. And so he had pioneered a series of things called counters, which would digitally read out the frequency that was applied to the input, and this was done, first with vacuum tubes, and later with transistors, and still later with integrated circuits. But this whole area of digital counting was the basis, was half the basis of the frequency and time division, which was the division he was heading. So he was responsible. He took responsibility for frequency standards, and he took responsibilities, for counters. And it was into that environment that that I joined HP in, first as a summer job in June of 1964.
Charlie, was the digital revolution something that you were aware of that was happening at Caltech? In other words, were there instruments? Was Carver thinking about a transition from analog? Where were those things when you were a graduate student?
Well, the big deal when I was a graduate student really centered around semiconductor physics, and it's the applied physics form, and that was going to lead Carver to the LSI and the scalability thing, but that wasn't at Caltech at that time. I mean, Carver was interested in this. David Middlebrook was interested in this, and I don't really know the timing, but given that Carver probably had the responsibility for creating an awful lot of the doubly looking options that exist today, you probably have that history from him. But no, it was semiconductor physics. Caltech was, digital integrated circuits were something that was coming on the horizon, commercially at least, about the time I joined HP. I mean, those were the days when there were all sorts of different logic forms, RTL and T2L and Meckel were all names for relatively small integrated circuits that were different circuit embodiments that created gates and flip-flops. And certainly Caltech, I mean, the computer science course that I took at Caltech, which actually was taught by a visiting professor from IBM Labs. I mean, the whole concept of creating stuff out of ands and ors, and this ties back to Shannon, and it ties back to actually Shannon was dealing with things with relays. The computers that existed at the time were not transistor based; they were vacuum tube based. You built your flip flops fundamentally out of well, at least the Iliac, I believe, had a 9 triode embodiment for a flip flop. So think of 9 vacuum tubes to create a flip flop, 1 bit. I mean, this is so much in the dark ages with regards to where we are now. It's really hard to conceive. Uh, so I was really, in many ways, I was really lucky because this whole area was emerging about the time I had gotten a really sound foundation in applied physics and applied math, and really, interestingly enough, had no confidence that I could sit down and whip out a design of anything, but knowing that that if I put my mind to it, I could solve basically any problem that was solvable.
Charlie, circa 1964, 1965, as you were thinking about potential professional opportunities, was HP considered like the hot place to work in the way that maybe a Google or an Apple would be today for young electrical engineers?
Oh, absolutely. And it truly was. Well, for me, it worked really, really well because it was it. Looking at Al Bagley, I realized that he was the antithesis of the organization man, and any organization that could have accommodated him in this leadership role could not be all bad. No, I didn't. At the time I started out, I had no idea of how to monetize invention, and I certainly didn't understand how to drill down and figure out what the customer needs were and what I had to do in terms of coming up with solutions that people would actually want at some point in the future. I mean, in many ways, I had the background and I had a blank slate.
Now, another thing that I'd like you to develop further, you mentioned that the opportunity to transform your summer position at HP into a full-time career, there's a story there, so I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, okay. When I left Caltech, I had my acceptance to start at Harvard Business School early in September, right after Labor Day, and I viewed the summer job at HP as really my only opportunity to understand what a working engineer did in the real world. And so the first project I was given was well, it was laid out to me in very broad terms. I later came to realize that I was expected to come up with optimized resistors to make a given design function optimally, but that was not the problem I was given. It was described to me that if you wanted to count a frequency that was higher than your flip-flop could toggle, there was a way of doing it. Instead of trying to record the ones and zeros um, in the initial flip-flop. I mean, the initial flip-flop, obviously, if you cascade them, the initial flip-flop has to operate twice as fast as the next one in the line, and so on down. So the entire problem in terms of counting a higher frequency rested in this scheme with generating the first flip-flop that would operate at a very high frequency. However, if you would instead basically generate a shift register, which if you want to divide by 10, you would have 10 elements in your shift register, and at the end of the register, you would feed back the negative output of the last flip-flop, and you would form a Mobius ring. And so this would force the flip-flops to only have to shift or toggle at a tenth the rate of the incoming signal. And this was obviously something that Al Bagley had come up with. I mean, it was his crazy idea, and this was the job that I was given. And they gave me a suggested form of a circuit that could accomplish this. They gave me the transistor that they thought it was a 2N708, if I remember correctly. It was a relatively expensive transistor that had a relatively high high speed capability. Well, the speed at which gain would the frequency at which gain would drop to 1 was relatively high, so I was given a suggested design, and certainly this was the first time that I'd ever faced this class of problem. But I started trying to analytically go through and optimize it, and I found myself, it was a multivariable problem, and after a couple of days of doing that and just chasing my tail, I realized that there was a possibility of graphically showing the regions in which you got performance, and I could deal with each of the variables as levels of a graph. Well, they were areas on a graph, and by then superimposing these graphs over each other, I could see the region in which I could look for optimal solutions.
Charlie, was this more of a Eureka moment, or was this more the grind of working day in and day out and figuring it out bit by bit?
Well, the first part, I figured out relatively soon how to sub-optimize each of about 5 different variables. However, that did not help me optimize a general solution. and and so the Eureka moment and the approach, the graphical approach wasn't a Eureka moment, because I had no idea when I actually started down that path that it was going to work. The Eureka moment came when, using that, I could pick the component values that fit into the circuit. I could put them into the circuit, and it worked. Mm-hmm. This project, I believe, I was given an approach, but in the process of implementing this, I actually had to go through getting a PC board laid out that was going to have all of the components on it that you would plug in, and then be able to test it. And of course, the Eureka moment came when the whole thing worked. I think I was expected to spend my whole summer coming up with this, and it was worth an engineer spending a whole summer, because I would pick up probably a factor of 4 or 5 in terms of the highest frequency that a counter could actually count, and that was a big deal, because over time this was the progression that occurred in these products, and the products were in relatively high demand in the aerospace industry and other electrical engineering companies that were doing design work. I mean, that was what the output of what Hewlett Packard did.
Charlie, is this all the story that got you from the summer position into the full-time work, or this is already after your full-time?
No, this is the first 4 or 5 weeks of the summer.
Wow, that's a formative summer. That's a busy summer.
Oh, you better believe it. And I mean, my whole point was I had to get through this so that they would give me another project. This was my chance at this class of experience. I think I related to you the story. It was about 2/3 of the way through the summer, and I was in the lab working at about 6:30 at night. I thought I was alone, and Al Bagley comes up, and he, in his dry way, he says, "Charlie, Trimble, what's wrong? Can't you get your work done in a normal working day?" And then he sits down and we talk. And so that went on, and I was dead set to going to Harvard. And 2 days before I was to leave, he calls me into his office and said, and throws out this problem of evoked responses, basically pulling brain waves out of the noise. And he said, "Well, we have a major program going on to build multi-channel analyzers. These are basically histogram generators, digital histogram generators, that if you're looking at radioactive, probabilistic sort of things, you want to have. This is the two-dimensional counter, basically, for probability distributions." And what I learned later was, I didn't realize at the time, and I learned later, what he really expected me to do was to come up with a plug-in that would go into that major instrument that had 20 people working on it. But certainly when I accepted the challenge, I had no idea of this. And later I had no idea of this. And I came up with enough innovation that he decided that that I ought to make my own computer of average transients and not live with a plug-in that that had the restrictions that would have been placed on doing that. So my transition was really that I overachieved as well. I say overachieved. I have to do this lightly because at one point, after I had my my printed circuit board fabricated, I actually had to ask one of my associates which lead was the emitter on the transistor. I understood band theory, I understood how transistors work, but I certainly, partially because I refused to continue taking the lab course my senior year, I never played with a transistor. In any event, so I started learning how to become an engineer. I certainly didn't learn how to become an engineer, but I started the process of learning, and I think it must have been Al Bagley. Well, it was Al Bagley that decided he wanted to convince me to stay, and he was willing to do virtually anything. The price I paid was that in the same time frame that this multi-channel analyzer came out with 20 people working on it, my project peaked at 4. And the complexity of the projects were equivalent. So the price I paid was to be seriously underfunded. Now, the positive for me was that Al was a arch analytic. He had trouble making up his mind. So I could basically do anything I wanted to do. I would tell him what I was going to do, knowing full well that he probably wouldn't tell me not to do it. But I took full responsibility for the outcome. And certainly it was following that first summer, as I was evolving the design of this project, what happened is, like solving any hard problem, you don't have to know how to solve it to attack it, and you keep working at it and recycling your answer. And at one point, I can remember asking the engineering manager of the division, how do I know when I have put enough into this phase of the project? And he looked at me and said, you will know.
What benchmarks did he know that he was waiting for you to find that you would see yourself? What was he looking for from you?
He had no idea of what I was doing. And actually, the benchmarks were pretty obvious. I mean, I had to come up with them. There were project reviews, projects did get canceled, but as long as as there were real promise. Progress against a hard problem was valued more highly than being super accurate in terms of how long it was going to take. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But then I was really very impatient with myself, and so I probably was more disappointed in the length of time that things took than anybody that was supervising me.
Charlie, given the fact that you were given the freedom to work on this hard problem, to what extent does that suggest that more broadly you were working in a basic science environment where you're just trying to figure stuff out and your work is not necessarily connected to the bottom line of the company? And to what extent was Al sort of just giving you an education prior to doing work that would be more readily useful to the company?
Well, Al was making a relatively small bet on me. And so it's if you look at it as an investment strategy, this is the part of your portfolio that is speculation. And yes, by working on a problem where it really wasn't defined, it was neither defined nor was it obvious how to accomplish it. The approach is clearly applied science because I basically had to find ways of accomplishing things, and so these basically there are no textbook results that you can go to tell you how to do it. Many of the engineers in the lab actually came out of Utah and Utah State at the time, and those kids could whip off designs. I mean, in an interview, college interview, they could whip off designs of circuits and things, and the best of them were really very good at the craft of engineering, of creating something inside of a totally known environment or a largely known environment. I was given the opportunity basically to cut my teeth on the outer edge of this. Someone else with the project that I was given, somebody else had come to the conclusion that that if I were successful in producing this or figuring out how to do this, there would be a market for it. I mean, later in my career at HP, I went through the process of figuring out how to determine shall I say, the probability of having a successful outcome. When companies, most of the government contracting does not require, and as a matter of fact, doesn't use company-generated innovation. They're told what what the product should look like. There is some give and take, but R&D is not done on speculation. I mean, HP was different in this environment because the R&D was done on speculation. There was no guarantee that any product that was developed at a lab at HP would actually result in a commercial success. The success of the company depended on engineers figuring out solutions that other people would want to buy. And going back to the next spec syndrome, when you're designing products for other engineers, you've got a really easy beta test site right next to you. And you can get feedback immediately as to whether it's useful or what should be changed. When you're not doing things for other engineers, which I wasn't with this biomedical computer, it was a completely different world. And it really did consume the first 4 years of my life as a practicing technologist.
What were some of the broader research questions that surrounded this initial project? What were, best case scenario, the outcome of successful research in this work?
Well, all right. Now you've got to realize that first of all, we take computers for granted. We take microprocessors for granted. None of this. Well, the computers existed in the very large scale. I mean, I did have access to the Burroughs 5500 at Stanford, which I did use to simulate the digital designs that I was coming up with. But what I was creating was a special purpose computer without the use of microprocessors. I mean, basically, the tools I had were flip-flops and gates. I had to build state machines. I had never taken a course in state machines. I had never taken a course in digital signal processing. All of these things basically were learned. I did manage to take a couple of courses in biomedical engineering at Stanford, and I learned in those courses that when dealing with the biomedical community, simplicity trumped flexibility and precision. The products that had a switch that gave you low, medium, and high for noise rejection sold much better than systems which allowed you to optimize it. So, I mean, these are human lessons and people lessons as opposed to fundamental research. The first realization that I got on the signal averager was that yes, you could do a job of pulling information out of the noise simply by adding the signals that you get from evoked responses in phase. And what you will see is a picture which is growing, and at the same time it's growing, the noise on the top of this picture is going to be decreasing. But I looked at that from a human factor standpoint and said, that isn't really what somebody wants to see, because human perception is based, is driven towards and is based on looking for things that change. And having, the noise reducing was what you wanted, but the growing signal was not, or the growing baseline was not. And so I wanted to figure out, and to do that, you needed an average, not a sum. Well, there was no way of dividing, or certainly no way of dividing by n. And again, this predates most of the computer science. The math that's associated, the applied math that's associated with a lot of computer science now, is looking at the world in terms of algorithmic based reasoning as opposed to closed form reasoning. I mean, the physics of classical mechanics and basically all of physics, or certainly all of the physics that I learned at Caltech, was directed towards deriving closed form equations for being able to understand and predict behavior. But when you're dealing with a computer, certainly we know today that you want to use a digital stepwise algorithmic approach to the solution of many of the problems. This certainly wasn't in my knowledge base, and it certainly, there may have been people at Caltech that did understand that, but I didn't. And as a matter of fact, my fourth year of mathematics, applied math, was partial differential equations, which was again closed form, and basically all computer science approaches to the turbulence problems and a lot of the other things now are all algorithmic based, largely because partial differential equations have major areas where there is no solution. But in any event, certainly, so the first thing I really had to solve, which actually is trivially derived when you sit down to do it, was an algorithmic way of achieving an average. A to the n equals a to the n minus 1 plus a correction factor. So the new average is the old average plus a correction factor. And then if you want to get a real average, you have to divide by n, to get this correction term. Well, that was impossible, or it certainly was impossible with the tools that I had available. And I came to the realization that, if you would divide by the nearest power of 2, you lost something, but it wasn't clear how much you lost, but you could get an average which was stable. And so using that hypothesis, from that hypothesis, I went and simulated this stuff. And I did a fair amount of simulation, and I later came to the conclusion that you lose about 0.4 of a dB of signal to noise ratio enhancement by using the nearest power of 2, which for all practical purposes was in the noise. And so that was that was a seminal understanding point. The other was that, you know, if you kept n running, you got a true average. But if you fixed n in your correction factor, you got a moving average. So if you had something that was time varying, you could follow it with some signal to noise ratio enhancement. I mean, you would obviously there was a limit to how much you would get, but then you could follow the change. Now, once I got later, again, these were more courses that I took at Stanford. I took courses in Fourier transforms. I mean, this whole time domain versus frequency domain, and understanding how things switch back and forth, and you choosing the domain that you're going to use depending on the instruments you have and the problem you want to solve. All of this, the theory of why all of this worked was much more obvious. But again, this is background I didn't have, and actually the basic algorithms that I described to you, HP got patents on. You know, I was really excited about the fact that I was generating patents until the head of the patent department came over a couple of years after my original patent. My original formula had been patented in the biomedical world, and showed me a patent that had just been issued to IBM for the same formula in a different field. Now, HP could care less about that because they were using patents as freedom to operate, and they traded them with the other companies so that nobody sued anybody. They certainly didn't have to worry about IBM because they had cross-licensing arrangements with IBM for all the patents. But that soured me for a while on patents, and it was only much later that I realized, especially if you're a small company, you desperately need a good patent estate.
Charlie, you mentioned biomedicine. I wonder more broadly if you can talk a little bit about the industries or even specific clients that were interested in this research.
Well, they were okay. Now, what I'm doing now is I'm building an instrument that is going to be of value to people that are doing research. I mean, that is what the product is. I mean, it's it won't be purchased by another engineer, but it will be purchased by perhaps somebody in a psychology department, or somebody in some professor doing research in biology. And the two really obvious places had to do with studying children that weren't responding and figuring out whether they were impaired with hearing or vision. And you could, by looking at the brain waves that are evoked from either a sound or a flash of light, you can get a fair amount of information about this. Also, the latency in terms of the response of the brainwave to the stimulus is of interest. So these actually, I think, were the two features that or the thoughts that Al had when he came up with trying to do this as an instrument.
Charlie, you mentioned taking classes at Stanford. What were the kinds of classes that you felt you needed to supplement your Caltech education?
Oh, well, anything that I hadn't already I hadn't already studied that related to what I was doing, because clearly if somebody else has figured out answers to parts of the questions that you are looking at, it's an awful lot more efficient to be able to build on those than to have to start and recreate everything yourself.
Charlie, I wonder if you ever crossed paths with Muhammad Attallah.
Doesn't ring a bell. Maybe if you told me more about it,
He was part of the HP Associates. He invented the MOSFET at Bell Labs.
Oh, all right. Yeah. Okay, fine. Yes. HP Associates was, but they ended up being big in the whole LED environment, light emitting diodes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was much more familiar with things that are coming out of the LED work, and that took a long time to take off too. Yeah, there were several. There were several different facilities at HP that, well, three or four, certainly three. Certainly, HP Associates had their own processing capability. There was a silicon on sapphire approach that was taken, and I think largely because we had already in F&T had a both a bipolar and a MOS IC facility that in the bipolar sense we could put down 500 matched transistors on a chip of silicon, and we could do a couple thousand gates on an IC with a 7 or 9 mask MOS CMOS process. And certainly HP Labs and some of the operating divisions were into this very, very early. I can remember in 1965, Bagley bringing in integrated circuit engineering. It was a consulting firm to basically teach us about integrated circuits, and this was preparatory to his putting in the integrated circuit facility in frequency and time.
Charlie, were you aware of any defense contracting work that HP was doing in the 1960s?
They hated defense contracting work. And the reason they hated defense contracting work is there was a period when HP was, they were doing some with the government and especially selling oscilloscopes. And there was a time when there was a major downturn in business. So HP bid a oscilloscope contract to the government at essentially at factory cost, so he could keep his employees working. They got the contract, but then the government came after them for overcharging for all the other oscilloscopes that HP had made for them. And so Packard vowed not to take government contracts. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In fact, actually, I've got a story I can tell you. My last job at F&T, working for Bagley, was engineering manager of the IC facility there, and Hughes desperately wanted access to our ability to put down matched transistors on a chip for making a high-speed A to D converter for one of the aircraft programs. I think it was the F-18 program. So we finally agreed that we would sell them chips at 9 times our factory cost, and they would do absolutely everything to qualify them for the military. So there was very, very little there was very, very little contracting work that went on with the government.
Charlie, were you following at all Japan's increasing importance in electronics?
You better believe it. Very, very. They were taking over, and this was. As a matter of fact, when I started with the GPS program, I knew I had to get to $100 factory cost on a sales price on GPS, or the Japanese were going to teach me how to do it. Mm. So no, I was really aware of that. I watched the whole thing.
Did you ever travel to Japan? Were you ever involved in HP's efforts to work with the Japanese?
No. I think they had an operation in Japan, but the problem with that is that as a foreign company, you couldn't get first-rate students out of Tokyo University. You could only get second-rate students.
Why?
Because the first-rate students went to Sony Research or Hitachi Research. They did not go to a foreign company. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Did Al Bagley remain a mentor to you?
Yeah, well, he certainly was. In some ways, all right, he was clearly a mentor to me while I was at HP. And I did talk to him about things after I left, but I would say that after I left HP, it's sort of like with your parents, the difference between being a child and being an adult. And my year in Germany did indeed complete the transition for me inside my family. My mother and father were very close friends after I came back, but it was no longer a parent-child or child-parent relationship. And I can say the same thing with Al. After I left HP, I was an adult.
In the professional sense of the word.
Yeah, in the professional sense of the word. But seeing Al's struggles inside of HP, in executive roles, which I did get to see while I was there for 14 years, and the transitions that occurred at HP basically occurred over that period of time.
Now, when you say struggles, do you mean budgetary, administrative? What was he dealing with?
Approaches to running the business. I will never forget comment he made to me. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon. He was sitting having a cup of coffee in a deserted cafeteria, and I walked through, and during the conversation, he made a statement that I've kept with me my entire life, and that was, management is the process of learning to work with those that you hate.
That's great.
And looking back on it, that clearly represented the struggle that he was having with John Young, and he ended up being John Young's chief engineer. Oh, just a second. I got to take this. Good morning.
Charlie, unmute. I put you on mute. If you can unmute yourself. There we go.
I have nothing. I have nothing that I'm trying to hide. I have I have an island in the Bahamas. Okay, small. It's 25 acres, but it's right outside of Marsh Harbor, and the main house was absolutely devastated by the hurricane 2 years ago.
Oh.
And so I'm in the process of rebuilding. Fortunately, my caretaker actually can manage a team of Haitians, and they started camping out on the island. I mean, no water, no electricity, nothing, no tractors, and the house is now the shell is back together, and I'm in the process. I'm in the process of putting in the kitchen, and the quote I got from the local supplier was absurdly high. So I decided that I was going to do this through Home Depot, and
I didn't know Home Depot served the Bahamas.
No, they don't. But they will. They will deliver to tropical shipping in West Palm Beach, and tropical shipping will consolidate and transfer to Marsh Harbor. But so before, if I had been at home, life would have been simple. But everything fell apart Monday, and things are going back and forth. So that's what it's all about.
Okay, well, progress indeed. I hope you're making the house a little more hurricane-proof than it was last time, too.
Well, actually, what happens is after 40 years, rebar in the tropics corrodes.
Yeah.
And when the rebar corrodes, the strength of the thing that holds the tops of the walls together decreases.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so, yes, there's a lot of new rebar, and it's actually constructed more soundly than it was originally.
Okay.
But,
well, Charlie, to get back to Al Bagley and this amazing comment about the management culture, I'll just ask you if you can editorialize, right to the top. Were the issues that Al was fighting against, did they go all the way to Bill Hewlett and David Packard? Or had HP gotten so big at that point that there was a bureaucracy that even the founders couldn't control with regard to just doing the most important research and not having too much fat around the edges?
All right. Some of this is a guess. I mean, I was in the last cadre of engineers that came in that actually ended up presenting to Hewlett and Packard personally. So my projects got presented. So I knew both of them, and they and certainly I copied I copied the HP culture, or I adopted the HP culture during the period of time when my company was growing at 40% a year plus. And actually, I would say that that Al Bagley was more aligned to to operationally the way that Hewlett and Packard operated, but was probably less effective at monetization than John Young. John Young played the good guy, bad guy game, and many companies do this. He had a brilliant. I almost want to call him an attack dog. I mean, the phrase. In many ways, he was similar to Andy Grove, if you know the Andy Grove, Gordon Moore story.
Yes.
And so that was John Young's management style. And so in some respects, Al was more result oriented and putting responsibility on the individual. And I would say Paul Lely was much better at instilling fear. So yes, there were differences. There were differences in style, but then, Hewlett and Packard were very different people too. Just a second, Liang, you got it. They were very different people too. Packard was the businessman. Hewlett was the engineer. They had they managed by objectives, and they basically had 9 principles that were the quote HP way, that Packard said, well, we wrote down because this is what we want to have happen. It isn't what we always do.
It's aspirational.
Yeah. But in terms of management, the way you're dealing with people and all that.
Charlie, do you have a specific memory of when the term Silicon Valley started to be used?
I don't have a specific memory, but I do know that it certainly, well, my guess is that it would be around the time that Intel was formed. I mean, you started out with Shockley and Fairchild and National and but Intel, well, it was Motorola, Fairchild, Intel was the movement fundamentally. Shockley was an offshoot, and I'm not quite sure where National Semi came in.
And for your group, in F&T, who did you see as the key competitors to HP?
We had a relatively dominant position. I mean, there were companies like Beckman Scientific. It wasn't just. I mean, there were companies that made. HP was about. I think HP was about $125 million company the year before I joined. They were already with the exception of Tektronix, which was dominant in oscilloscopes, they had, I think they were the dominant player in the scientific / engineering instrumentation business. Beckman was clearly a second.
Now, as you rose in seniority at HP, did you have to take on administrative responsibilities in your own right?
Well, it depends on what you call administrative. I mean, if you're a group leader, you still have to do reviews, and you hire, you budget, you negotiate. You're a section manager. You have multiple groups reporting to you, but you're clearly and clearly when I ran R&D for the IC business, there was even more. But you didn't have, until my last job, I didn't have a secretary. Okay, I had access to a secretary. I had access to finance. I clearly knew the rules in terms of how to budget and how to get around things. I had figured out how to move money. If I hadn't spent all of my money in a given year, I figured out how to move money to the next year. I had learned that part of the business, which I would guess any rising manager would figure out.
Now, would you say, did you become a mentor in your own right? Did you have people whose careers you helped foster at HP?
Absolutely. And I became head of the recruiting team for HP. It was Al's job at Caltech. And I clearly pushed that. I also, my greatest failure actually occurred when the IC tester, which I had gone out, I had researched, I had sold, I had gotten the final prototype approval. It was going to cost a negative $800,000 the following year, and then it was going to be profitable. And John Young had gone from having a $1.5 million discretionary budget for things that weren't absolutely essential to being $800,000 negative. And because of that, my project was canceled. And this was probably, I considered it the greatest failure. And interestingly enough, my remembrance there does go back to Paul Ely, who I may have made this comment to you. We were going over the 19th hole, and he said to me, "Trimble, your problem is you're not tough enough."
What did he mean by that?
Well, you can only guess, but I don't view myself as a street fighter. And I knew when I was starting my company that the highest risk was getting the company to $2 million a year in revenues. Because once I got there, I could start hiring people that would be better at that than I was.
And by risk, you mean you have to spend money to make money.
Well, yeah, but if I were going to lose it, I would lose it because of a street fight, because I didn't have the people to cover my own weaknesses.
Weaknesses meaning like a certain lack of ruthlessness, you mean?
Well, ruthlessness may be it, or we all have strengths and weaknesses, and any reasonable manager hires to cover their own weaknesses, because you are operating as a team, and you need to accomplish something, and so you have to have a team that does it. Now, I'm not willing, when I say ruthless, I'm not willing to shade things. I'm not willing to, and I'm not willing to be part of activities that shade things. But you don't always have to be as understanding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Charlie, it must have given you great pleasure to be able to go back to Caltech and recruit for yourself.
It did. And actually, I knew I was getting older when I found myself starting giving fatherly advice. And I mean, this was happening before I'm 30, so.
Had you kept in touch with Carver during these years?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, every time I went down, I saw him, and we talked. No, we were great friends. The fellow that ended up being the brilliant software engineer that actually made the GPS receiver possible, or certainly our embodiment of the GPS receiver possible, a fellow by the name of Tom Coates. He didn't show up for the interview, and I tracked him down. I knew I wanted to talk to him. I mean, he was one of three people that I knew I had to talk to when I was down there, and he had forgotten.
Charlie, to go back to an earlier comment, now that you were in a more relatively senior position, did you have a different perspective on the culture of excellence at Caltech? In other words, to go back to your earliest motivations for wanting to go to Caltech yourself, now at a different stage in life where there was a responsibility in your part to bring the best to HP, was your initial inclination even from high school only strengthened from this vantage point?
Oh, well, no question in the world. I mean, what was really clear, there weren't very many Caltech students that were applicable to, or graduating BS students that were applicable to the HP environment. And as a matter of fact, it was pretty obvious there were maybe 20 in any given year that were applicable to the world that HP played in. And I knew perfectly well that the underlying strength of a Caltech education was the ability to solve really hard problems. And so I was hiring for that capability. I basically had to warp the interview system inside of HP so that it recognized this. And you warp it by making sure that the people that are on the committee or the group that is going to be interviewing the prospective student are people that have the ability to solve hard problems. Mm-hmm. I mean, you don't actually have to come from Caltech to be able to solve hard problems, but I would say that if I leave MIT aside, there is virtually no other place that that generates the consistency that Caltech generates.
And were you recruiting specifically out of EE or more broadly at Caltech?
At what?
Out of electrical engineering.
Oh well, no, I was. I also had to. I had to. Certainly, HP wanted to hire electrical engineers. They hired their mechanical engineers from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, mm-hmm. and these people built nice-looking instrument boxes, largely. Mm-hmm. There were times when you hired specialty people for an IC facility or a semiconductor facility, but what HP really wanted was double E's. I had to basically I had to say that at the time, options that are computer science, applied physics, material science, and double E are all in the same rubric. Now, indeed, Caltech double E faculty play a incredibly important role in all of those in all of those options. And as a matter of fact, Carver is the one that's responsible for setting up the damn options because he wanted the students that were in, for example, applied physics, not to have to take all of the all-line double E courses that had nothing to do with semiconductor physics. Mm-hmm. And so that was in part what created many of the options.
Charlie, a very different question, more on the sociological side. I'm curious, being in Northern California in the late 1960s, with all of the anti-war sentiment and things like that, superimposed upon David Packard's decision to become a high-ranking member of the Nixon administration in the Department of Defense. What, if anything, was the political culture at HP like during these years?
Okay. HP was apolitical. I mean, totally. Or at least I got no sense of, and as a matter of fact, Packard's going to the Defense Department certainly was seen at HP more as Packard being willing to try to help the country make better decisions for the Defense Department than it was support for Richard Nixon. Now, I'm sure the archives will have plenty of information to see where David Packard was politically. I assume he was Republican, but other than that, I have no knowledge. Now, the anti-war movement, what was going on at Berkeley and what was going on at Stanford, I was intimately aware of because I was taking courses at Stanford, and I was sitting in. I would have lunch at times in the cafeteria, and at the table next to me there would be students that were talking about trying to arouse crowd participation, and they would talk about, well, let's try this, and if that doesn't work, let's try this. And I am very aware of when the chain link fence was put up around the HP facility on the hill. And the story there that it was a HP board member that told the board that in 10 days there was going to be a march on HP. It turns out his son was one of the ringleaders. He didn't agree with his son, but he listened to him. Yeah, they were going after the atomic clocks, not having the foggiest notion that all that meant was the use of the relaxation of the cesium atom to form a very, very precise frequency standard. And yes, we were in the latter stages of the Vietnam War. The whole draft thing was getting big, and there clearly was a great deal of agitation.
And what about you, Charlie? Were you apolitical yourself? Were you politically engaged at all?
I really didn't have time to be political. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was 100% focused. I mean, I'm conservative by nature, but I'm fiscally conservative by nature, but I'm not politically active.
Charlie, what were some of the first, or at least initial, ideas that you had about entrepreneurship? In other words, you're at Caltech, then you're at HP. What were some of the very early ideas that you might have what it take to go branch out on your own?
All right. In the time frame that I joined HP was running employment ads that said, want to start your own company, come work for us for a couple of years and learn how to do it. And so I viewed once, all right, what happened was I completed the, it took me 4 years, but I absolutely completed the computer of average transients. Sales met expectations, and so that was fine. I was given the complete freedom to figure out the next big thing that the division was going to do. And so I actually made use of the HP field organization to get in and talk to, I had decided that IC testers, dynamic IC testers, were the next big thing that HP ought to get into. I mean, or the division had to get into. It used the strength of the IC facility that we had. It used our knowledge of dealing with microwave signals. It used our knowledge of timing and logic and all of that. I spent 3 months basically interviewing people in the IC industry in terms of where things were going. I wasn't asking them what they wanted, because I knew it was going to take me 3 years to be able to deliver whatever was going to be delivered.
You're saying you were trying to forecast trends.
Yes. I wanted to understand their world enough that I could make a reasonable guess as to what they would want 3 years from now. Mm. And I did this. I then generated a 60-page proposal with all sorts of references, and also a list of potential customers. I got the buy-in for that required more than Al Bagley, and I got it. And so I then had the ability to build a team of 20 people. I actually picked up 3 techers. Actually, I got 3 in 1 year. I hit the jackpot. One of whom, the only reason he ended up graduating from Caltech was he took one of Carver's classes and he actually was able to do something. And so all 3 of these guys were really excited about the whole IC industry and IC testing. And as a matter of fact, after the project was canceled, those 3 Caltech students split off and formed their own company to produce IC testers. And actually it was Steve Bissett actually dropped off 5 years or so after that. He went off to do other things. But the other 2 continued, and I guess a couple of years ago, they sold the company to Teradyne for a goodly amount of money. So I was totally involved in putting this together and building it up, and in some ways that was why it truly was devastating when the project was canceled. What I did was I placed all of my people. I kept 4, 2 project leaders and 2 other people. And I placed all of my other people. I got every one of them at least 2 offers. I did the interim projects before I became manager of the IC facility.
Charlie, can you talk a little bit more about the circumstances of the cancellation? What happened?
Oh, John Young had no discretionary money to put into something that that wasn't vitally important to the company.
Yeah.
It was it was a it was a tough economic decision.
But the decision to categorize it as not vitally important to the company, did you take issue with that? Did you think that it was?
I thought it had great promise, but it did not have an existing market. And would our sales force be fully capable of selling $200,000 systems?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these were expensive systems. The sales force had, could do a good job of $2,000 to $20,000 boxes that they largely sold to the government, or they sold to government contractors, or leasing outfits that leased to government contractors. There were indeed marketing questions. It fell into the same category as when John Young canceled the GPS project.
Mm-hmm. 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 So what I'm hearing, Charlie, is that you really learned to be an entrepreneur internally at HP.
Absolutely. I made my mistakes on their dollar. I made many of my mistakes. I made a lot of other mistakes too, but I made, and in fact, my advice to anybody that wants to be an entrepreneur is they go and work for a technology-driven company for a few years and learn what it takes to monetize ideas.
On that note, Charlie, what do you see as one of your biggest mistakes at HP?
It's an interesting question. Because in my 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 approach of Sorry, I ran my computer out of power.
Oh, I figured that was it. I hope it also gave you a little more time to think about your answer.
Well, okay, the reason why I'm thinking is the question you asked is a question I would ask of anybody that I wanted to hire. Give me a mistake. All right, I do have a really good one. Okay. This, and in many ways, it's because I hadn't yet learned how hard I could push myself. We're back in the days of the single averager, and Bagley has allocated 6 feet of IEEE booth space to demonstrating this thing. I am supposed to be taking 3 units back to New York to demonstrate the thing. I'm in the process of building 4 final prototypes. Now, these are 12-inch, 19-inch racks. There's an incredible amount of electronics in each one of these boxes. And the deadline is Monday morning at 9 o'clock. The equipment has to be picked up to go on the trucks to go back to New York. On Friday, I had a unit that worked. By Saturday night at about 11 o'clock, I had another that was showable but with problems, a third one which was coming on stream, and the fourth one that I hadn't started. By 6 o'clock Sunday afternoon, I had destroyed the one that was working, and I was flogging around on the other 2. By 4 o'clock in the morning, I said, I'm not making it. It's not there. I have failed. So I went home, came in, told Bagley. He said, all right, you can take them as carry-on luggage when you fly back to New York. You have 2 weeks. All right. That was a resounding failure.
What dimensions, in terms of strategy, in terms of the science, in terms of the business, how do you define failure in this regard?
I had not realized what, when you become overly tired, you actually can make the situation much worse than it already is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I actually had destroyed process. I had destroyed progress in that weekend. It tells you that there is really a limit to what you can force yourself to do, or your ability to command yourself to do. And actually, that was an incredibly important lesson. And I'm glad I did it on their dime, not mine, because it would have destroyed a company. But we all have to know what our capabilities are and what our limits are. And clearly, I was not operating at my highest level of capability. Ordinary engineers would have had a lot easier time making the damn products work. In part, I solved the problem by not trying to. Well, I didn't have a choice then, but after that, I did indeed have the choice of letting people who can do things better than I can do them.
And Charlie, culturally at HP, with failure at this level, was that, I don't want to say was it encouraged, obviously it wasn't encouraged, but was it recognized that there was always a greater good at play, that there was productivity in failure?
You were never creamed for making the first mistake. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that the tolerance would be there if the mistakes were repeatedly made, but no, people were protected. And I found myself it wasn't universal, but I know that I was protected clearly from. I was protected and not chastised for having made a mistake or having failed. And it is really obvious to me that if you want creativity at an invention at a high level, you have to protect people from being hurt by making mistakes. It is absolutely essential. And throughout my entire career, I have worked really hard to set that up in place, because I really want people to reach. And it's only by reaching that you can do something that is really significant.
Charlie,
now,
I'll flip the question on its head. It'll be interesting to see if this is easier or harder to answer. What was your greatest success at HP?
There were two. The project I talked about, where we made the 4-bit quantizer for Hughes, was a huge success. Not only did we nail all of the technical problems, it was highly profitable to HP. And I wasn't totally responsible. I was certainly had a lot of responsibility for the technical success. I certainly had help with regards to the contract that called for them to pay us 9 times factory cost to make these chips. And there's a little bit of serendipity there, but you see, when you have, in the early days, when we had a IC facility, when things were working, they worked very, very well. When things were not working, it was awful. So, today you expect really high yields out of your IC processes, especially in production. We could make a lifetime supply of something in a month when things were working well. And when things weren't working well, we couldn't make anything. So 9 times factory cost, the way that the accounting was being done, it averaged in all of the bad runs with the runs that made the total lifetime supply for an instrumentation division work. And so when the accounting and compliance people from Hughes came in to look at the books because they were worried about the price of the chips, and they saw the data, they said, well, who in the world at Hughes would ever have signed such a contract? All right. The other one, after the IC tester project was canceled, I decided that my career at HP, really, I needed something a bit safer.
You mean for your own sanity or for your own job security?
Well, for my own career path at HP.
Okay.
No, my sanity was fine. I mean, it was a loss, but it was a loss.
It wasn't a problem.
No, it wasn't a problem with sanity. So I wanted to, I had this idea of how to generate an instrument that would measure a 1 nanosecond time interval in a digital form, and so I set a very brilliant person that later went on that I later sponsored to get a PhD at Stanford. Obviously, I'm using Stanford because they're next door, not for any other reason, but to do that. And the other one was I decided that we were coming into a digital age where where instruments were being controlled by programmable calculators and computers, and that what HP needed was an interface standard that would connect computers and programmable calculators to instruments. And for that to happen, I had to get both the people in the computer division and the people in the calculator division to agree on an interface. And I had to get project managers in several of the operating divisions to agree to put this standard into their product. Mm-hmm. Because you need both sides. And I had a project leader that I had on the IC tester project that was really good at this standards sort of activity. And we basically got a team that involved Rick, the fellow from Loveland, and not Loveland, but come on, it's just over the border in just north of Loveland. Anyway, where they were making calculators, and somebody from the computer division, together to come up with a standard that seemed to make sense. And then my job was to figure out how to get project leaders to incorporate the standard into their product. And to make things even better, I generated a set of glue boxes that did things, provided switches and other things that might be useful, and came up with the cables that would do it. Well, this turned out to be successful. I mean, I only had to roll over a couple of project leaders and project leaders are basically king on their own project, but they can be subject to some external pressure. And I only had to use real external pressure on a couple of the cases. And not just in the division, not just in frequency and time, but elsewhere in the company. Anyway, this led to the HP IEEE 488 standard, which is given out, and HP provided cables. And I mean, these are the cables that have those 50-pin ribbon connectors, two of them, one on each side, so you could stack them. And it required the 50-pin connector on the instrument. And it turned out that really was extremely important for HP. We didn't make a lot of money on my glue boxes, which allowed you to have various external switches and stuff. But we did make an awful lot of money out of the cables. The cables were sold at $50 a piece, and they cost about $350 to be made externally. So my greatest success monetarily at HP may very well have been the IEEE 488 standard cable.
In the long range of history, what do you see as the impact of this development?